July 7th, 1944, 10:38 at night. Northern outskirts of Caen, France. Captain Pierre Lebrun, 42 years old, resident of Caen for his entire life, crouched in his cellar as the world above him disintegrated. For the past hour, the sound had been beyond comprehension. Not individual explosions, but continuous thunder that shook the foundations of his medieval home, that brought dust and plaster cascading from the ceiling, that made breathing difficult to the choking debris. Lebrun held his wife and 2 daughters close, praying the stone walls above would hold. His family had survived 31 days since the Allied invasion on June 6. 31 days of artillery bombardment, street fighting, random shelling. 31 days trapped between German defenders who used the city as fortress and Allied forces trying to capture it. But this was different. This wasn't artillery. This was aerial bombardment on scale Lebrun couldn't comprehend. Wave after wave of British bombers. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, dropping tons of high explosive on the ancient Norman capital. The city that William the Conqueror had built. The city where Joan of Arc had been tried. The city that stood for 1,000 years was being systematically erased from existence. At 10:51, the bombing stopped. The silence was shocking after the continuous roar. Lebrun waited, listening. Would they emerge to find their home still standing? Would the city still exist? When Lebrun finally climbed from the cellar at dawn, he found and transformed into moonscape. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Medieval churches were rubble. The castle of William the Conqueror, 900 years old, was damaged but standing. Streets were impassable, choked with debris. Fires burned everywhere. Bodies lay in ruins. Civilians who hadn't reached shelters in time, who had been buried alive when buildings collapsed. The bombing that Lebrun had survived was Operation Charnwood. The British offensive to capture Caen had been promised for D-Day, but had taken 33 days and counting. The 2,500 tons of bombs dropped by 467 Royal Air Force heavy bombers had killed approximately 3,000 French civilians and destroyed 80% of the city. But the bombing hadn't captured Caen. German forces still held the northern sections. The medieval city was being destroyed to save it, and the cost in French lives was mounting with every failed attempt to break through German defenses. This is the story of the battle for Caen, of the city that was supposed to fall on D-Day but required 33 days of brutal fighting of the British and Canadian forces who suffered thousands of casualties attacking fortified positions, of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend whose fanatical teenage soldiers committed war crimes while fighting to the death, of the strategic failure that questioned Montgomery's competence, and of the French civilians who paid the price for liberation with their city and their lives. The plan for D-Day, June 6, 1944, called for British Second Army under General Miles Dempsey to land on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, push inland, and capture Caen by nightfall. Caen was critical objective for multiple reasons. The city controlled road and rail networks radiating across Normandy. Capture of Caen would provide British forces with communications hub necessary for operations deeper into France. The terrain south and east of Caen was ideal for airfield construction, relatively flat, well-drained, suitable for heavy bomber operations. The Allies needed forward airfields to support ground operations and reduce dependence on aircraft flying from England. Most importantly, Caen anchored the eastern end of the invasion front. Capturing the city would prevent German forces from using it as base for counterattacks against Allied beachheads. Montgomery's plan called for British forces to capture Caen and draw German armored reserves into grinding attritional battle, while American forces broke out through weaker defenses in the west. The plan assumed German forces would be disorganized by pre-invasion bombing and naval bombardment. That initial resistance would be light, that British armor could exploit inland before German reserves arrived. These assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. British 3rd Infantry Division landed on Sword Beach at 0725 hours June 6. Initial resistance was moderate. The beach was secured by mid-morning. Forces pushed inland toward Caen, approximately 9 miles from the coast. But progress slowed rapidly as German resistance stiffened. German's 716th Infantry Division, which held the coastal defenses, had been weakened by bombardment but hadn't collapsed. Pockets of resistance delayed British advance. More critically, German armored reserves were closer than Allied intelligence expected and responded faster than anticipated. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned southeast of Caen, counterattacked toward the coast on the afternoon of June 6. The attack was poorly coordinated and ultimately repulsed, but it delayed British advance for crucial hours. By nightfall June 6, British forces were still 3 miles north of Caen, nowhere near their objective. The failure to capture Caen on D-Day was the first indication that the Normandy campaign would be longer and costlier than planned. What Montgomery had expected to accomplish in hours would require weeks. What he expected to cost hundreds of casualties would cost thousands. The German forces defending Caen represented some of the most fanatical and capable units in the Wehrmacht. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth, was a unique formation recruited primarily from members of the Hitler Youth organization. Most soldiers were 17 to 19 years old. Officers and NCOs were Eastern Front veterans transferred to provide leadership and training. The division had been formed in 1943 specifically as elite force. Recruitment standards were stringent. Physical fitness, ideological indoctrination, volunteers only. Training was intensive. By June 1944, the division comprised approximately 20,000 men equipped with modern tanks, self-propelled guns, and support weapons. The division commander was SS Brigadier Fritz Witt, 43 years old, Eastern Front veteran. The division's most infamous commander would be SS Standenführer Kurt Meyer, 33 years old, who took command after Witt was killed by naval gunfire on June 14th. Meyer embodied the aggressive, ruthless leadership that characterized the division. The Hitlerjugend soldiers were ideologically committed to Nazism in ways that Wehrmacht regulars often weren't. They'd been indoctrinated from childhood. They believed in German racial superiority, in Hitler's mission, in fighting to the death rather than surrendering. This ideological fanaticism made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. The 12th SS Panzer Division arrived in Caen sector on June 7th, the day after D-Day. The division immediately counterattacked British and Canadian forces north of the city. The attacks were aggressive, well-executed, and effective. British advance stalled. Canadian forces advancing from Juno Beach toward and were stopped by Hitlerjugend counterattacks. But the Hitlerjugend also began committing war crimes almost immediately. On June 7th and 8th, Canadian prisoners were executed at Ardenne Abbey near Caen. Approximately 20 Canadian soldiers, captured during fighting, were shot in groups by SS troops. The executions were deliberate murders, violations of Geneva Conventions. They set tone for the brutal fighting that would characterize the Caen battle. Meyer personally ordered some executions and was present at others. After the war, he was convicted of war crimes related to these murders and sentenced to death. Later commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1954 and lived until 1961, remaining unrepentant about his actions. The presence of the Hitlerjugend meant that fighting around would be exceptionally vicious. These weren't soldiers looking for opportunities to surrender. They were fanatics who would fight from every building, every hedgerow, every defensive position until killed. Breaking through their defenses would require overwhelming force and accept horrific casualties. With Caen not captured on D-Day, Montgomery ordered Operation Perch for June 13th, a flanking maneuver to encircle the city from the west. British 7th Armored Division, the famous desert rats who had fought in North Africa, would advance around Caen's western flank, seize high ground at Villers-Bocage, and cut German supply lines. The operation began promisingly. The 7th Armored Division advanced rapidly through weak German defenses and reached Villers-Bocage by June 13th. The lead elements, a squadron of the 4th County of London Yeomanry with Cromwell tanks, pushed into the town and established positions on the high ground beyond. Then everything went wrong. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger tank from 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, was positioned near Villers-Bocage with a handful of Tigers and Panzer IVs. Wittmann, already an ace with 138 confirmed kills, spotted the British column. What followed was one of the most one-sided tank actions of the war. Wittmann, driving Tiger 007, charged down the main road into the British column. In approximately 15 minutes, Wittmann's Tiger destroyed over 20 British armored vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, carriers. The British column was decimated. Survivors abandoned vehicles and fled. Wittmann then drove into Villers-Bocage itself and engaged British forces in the town. His Tiger was eventually disabled by British anti-tank fire, and Wittmann withdrew on foot, but the damage was done. British advance was stopped. The 7th Armored Division, shaken by the ambush and facing increasing German resistance, withdrew from Villers-Bocage. Operation Perch failed. The flanking maneuver didn't encircle Caen. The attempt to bypass the city's defenses had been defeated by a handful of German tanks and aggressive leadership. Montgomery would need to attack Caen directly through prepared defenses and the Hitlerjugend. Montgomery's next attempt was Operation Epsom, launched June 26. This was a major offensive involving 3 divisions. approximately 60,000 British and Scottish troops supported by 600 tanks. The objective was to cross the Ardenne River southwest of Caen and seize Hill 112, dominating terrain overlooking the city. The operation began with artillery bombardment from over 700 guns. British 8 Corps attacked westward, attempting to punch through German lines and reach the Ardenne. The fighting was immediately brutal. German forces, including elements of the Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr Division, defended every hedgerow and village. Scottish 15th Division bore the brunt of initial attacks. The advance was measured in hundreds of yards per day rather than miles. Casualties mounted rapidly. German defensive positions, well prepared and stubbornly held, could be easily overrun even with overwhelming force. By June 28th, British forces reached the Ardenne River and established Bridgehead, but German counterattacks, including elements of 2 SS Panzer Corps transferred from Eastern Front, threatened the bridgehead. Fighting for Hill 112 was especially vicious. The hill changed hands multiple times. Both sides suffered catastrophic casualties. Montgomery called off Operation Epsom on June 30th without achieving objectives. Hill 112 remained contested. The advance had penetrated several miles but hadn't broken through German defenses. British casualties exceeded 4,000. German casualties were similarly heavy, but the line held. The pattern was clear. British offensives could achieve limited gains through overwhelming force, but German defenses were too strong, too well-positioned, too fanatically defended to be broken by conventional attacks. Caen remained in German hands, and Montgomery's credibility was being questioned. By early July, the failure to capture Caen had become a strategic problem affecting the entire Normandy campaign. American forces in the west were preparing for Operation Cobra, the breakout from the hedgerows toward Brittany and Paris. But American progress depended on British forces holding German armored reserves in the east. If Germans could disengage from Caen and move forces west, American breakout would face stronger opposition. Montgomery faced increasing criticism from multiple directions. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, questioned whether British forces were being aggressive enough. American commanders like Patton suggested British were too cautious. Churchill worried about British casualty rates and lack of progress. The press, both British and American, began questioning Montgomery's competence. Montgomery's response was to double down. He planned Operation Charnwood, a direct assault on Caen from the north using 3 infantry divisions supported by massive aerial bombardment. The operation would demonstrate British commitment to aggressive action and hopefully break the stalemate. But the decision to use heavy bombers against Caen itself was controversial. The city was still inhabited by thousands of French civilians. Bombing would inevitably cause civilian casualties. Moreover, the rubble created by heavy bombing might actually impede British armor's advance through narrow medieval streets. Montgomery's staff raised these concerns. The decision was debated, but Montgomery concluded that conventional methods had failed, that bold action was necessary, that the risk to civilians was acceptable given the strategic importance of capturing Caen. The bombing was approved. The French were not consulted. There was no warning to civilians to evacuate. The bombing would come without notice, at night, when people were in their homes. The rationale was that warning would also warn German defenders, allowing them to disperse forces and take cover. Strategic necessity overrode humanitarian concerns. Operation Charnwood began at dusk on July 7, 1944. At 2,150 hours, the first Royal Air Force bombers appeared over Caen. The operation involved 467 heavy bombers, Lancasters and Halifaxes, carrying approximately 2,500 tons of high-explosive bombs. The bombardment lasted until 22:30 hours, 40 minutes of continuous bombing. The bombers operated in waves, approaching from the north, dropping their loads on marked target areas in northern Caen, then turning for England. The bombing was conducted at medium altitude, approximately 15,000 feet, to avoid anti-aircraft fire. The effect on Caen was catastrophic. Medieval buildings constructed of stone and timber couldn't withstand 1,000-pound bombs. Entire city blocks collapsed. Churches dating to 11th century were destroyed. Residential neighborhoods vanished. Fires erupted across the city, creating firestorms that consumed structures that survived the blast effects. The civilian casualties were horrendous. Approximately 3,000 French civilians died during the bombing. Many were killed instantly when buildings collapsed. Others were buried alive in rubble. Some burned to death in fires. Survivors emerged to find neighborhoods erased, streets unrecognizable, bodies everywhere. The irony was that German military forces, the intended targets, suffered relatively light casualties. German defensive positions were on the outskirts of the city and in suburbs. German forces had constructed bunkers and shelters that protected against aerial bombing. The bombing fell primarily on residential areas still inhabited by civilians. Moreover, the rubble created by the bombing actually aided German defense. Streets that had been passable for armor were now blocked by collapsed buildings. British tanks would have to advance through choke points and narrow clear paths, vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. The bombing that was meant to facilitate British advance had complicated it. French civilians who survived the bombing were left with feelings of betrayal and anger mixed with understanding that liberation required sacrifice. Pierre Lebrun, emerging from his cellar to find his neighborhood destroyed and his neighbors dead, wondered whether the cost of liberation was worth the price. The Allies were destroying Caen to save it. The ground assault of Operation Charnwood began at dawn on July 8, hours after the bombing. British 3rd Infantry Division and Canadian 3rd Infantry Division, supported by 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, attacked Caen from the north. The initial advance was through devastated landscape. The bombing had created conditions resembling World War I battlefields. Cratered ground, rubble piles, destroyed infrastructure. Visibility was limited by smoke and dust. Navigation was difficult with landmarks obliterated. German resistance, despite the bombing, was immediate and effective. The Hitlerjugend forces holding northern Caen had survived the bombardment in their positions outside the city center. They engaged British and Canadian forces with small arms, mortars, anti-tank guns, and tanks positioned in hull-down positions. Canadian forces advancing through villages north of Caen faced particularly fierce resistance. The Hitlerjugend defended every building, every hedgerow. Casualties mounted rapidly. Canadian infantry companies that began the attack with 120 men were reduced to 50 or 60 within hours. Tank losses were substantial. German 88mm anti-tank guns and Panzer IV tanks destroyed British Churchill and Sherman tanks at ranges where Allied guns couldn't effectively engage. The fighting devolved into brutal close combat. Villages changed hands multiple times. Individual buildings were contested room by room. Flamethrowers were used to clear fortified positions. Artillery fire was called in on targets mere hundreds of meters from friendly forces. Snipers targeted officers and radio operators. Casualties accumulated on both sides. Despite horrendous losses, British and Canadian forces pushed into northern Caen by evening of July 8th. The advance was measured in hundreds of yards. Each position required combined arms assault. Infantry supported by tanks, artillery, and air strikes. German defenders withdrew from position to position, conducting fighting retreat while inflicting maximum casualties. By July 9th, British and Canadian forces occupied most of northern Caen up to the Orne River, which ran to the city center. German forces had withdrawn across the river to southern suburbs. The city was divided. Allies held the north, Germans held the south. Bridges across the Orne were destroyed. The battle paused temporarily as both sides regrouped. Caen had been partially captured, but at catastrophic cost. The city was ruins. Thousands of civilians were dead. British and Canadian casualties exceeded 3,000. German losses were also severe, perhaps 2,000 killed and wounded, and the city still wasn't completely secure. Southern sectors remained in German hands. The partial success of Operation Charnwood raised difficult questions about strategy, tactics, and the cost of operations. Military analysts and commanders debated whether the results justified the methods. The bombing had killed thousands of French civilians, while causing limited damage to German military forces. The rubble had complicated British advance rather than facilitating it. The strategic objective, capturing Caen to enable further operations, had been only partially achieved. Southern sections of the city remained in German hands, requiring additional operations to secure. French civilians who survived were traumatized. The bombing had been conducted without warning at night when families were sleeping. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed. Survivors had no homes, no possessions, limited access to food or water. They were refugees in their own city, dependent on British military for basic necessities. The relationship between French civilians and Allied forces was complicated by the bombing. Gratitude for liberation was mixed with anger at the destruction. Why didn't they warn us? Was question asked repeatedly. Why did they bomb residential areas instead of German positions? The answers, military necessity, security concerns, strategic requirements, provided little comfort to families who'd lost loved ones. From a military perspective, Operation Charnwood demonstrated the limitations of heavy bombing in support of ground operations. The strategic bombing campaign against German cities had shown that bombing could destroy infrastructure and kill civilians but couldn't by itself win wars. Charnwood reinforced this lesson in tactical context. Bombing could destroy cities but couldn't dislodge determined defenders from prepared positions. British and Canadian forces had suffered severe casualties for limited gains. 3,000 casualties to capture half a city was an exchange ratio that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. The fighting had been extraordinarily brutal. The Hitlerjugend had fought with fanatical determination, giving ground slowly and making allies pay for every yard. Before we continue with Operation Goodwood and the devastating British armor defeat, why the 12th SS Panzer Division's teenage fanatics committed war crimes while fighting to the death, and how Caen's destruction symbolized the terrible cost of liberation across France. If you're fascinated by these stories of strategic failures that question great commanders, of battles where overwhelming force couldn't break determined defense, of victories so costly they resembled defeats, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We publish deeply researched military history documentaries every week that bring you the operations that don't fit simple narratives, the battles where victory came at terrible price, the campaigns where civilians paid the cost of military decisions. Now back to July 1944, and the final operations to secure Caen completely. Montgomery's next attempt to break through German defenses around Caen was Operation Goodwood, launched July 18th. This was a massive armored offensive involving 3 British armored divisions, approximately 750 tanks, attacking from Bridgehead east and toward the Borgebus Ridge. The plan called for concentrated armored thrust to break through German lines, exploit into open country, and force German withdrawal from Caen area. The operation would demonstrate British capability for mobile warfare and hopefully restore Montgomery's damaged reputation. The operation began with even larger aerial bombardment than Charnwood. Over 2,000 Allied bombers, heavy bombers, medium bombers, fighter bombers, dropped over 7,700 tons of bombs on German positions. The bombardment targeted known German defensive lines, artillery positions, and suspected tank concentrations. The bombing was followed by artillery bombardment from 720 guns. The combined bombardment was the largest tactical airstrike in support of ground operations up to that point in the war. The intention was to stun German defenders, destroy defensive positions, and create conditions for armor breakthrough. At 0745 hours July 18th, British armor began advancing. The initial progress was encouraging. The bombardment had severely damaged German forward positions. British tanks penetrated several kilometers. By mid-morning, lead elements were approaching the Borgebus Ridge. Then the offensive ran into defensive system that the bombing hadn't destroyed. German forces had prepared multiple defensive lines with interlocking fields of fire. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns, deployed in anti-tank role, were positioned to engage at maximum range. German defensive doctrine emphasized defense in depth. Even if forward positions were overrun, subsequent lines would engage attackers. British tanks emerging from the bombardment area into open ground found themselves engaged by German anti-tank guns at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The flat terrain provided no cover. British tanks were silhouetted against skyline, visible to German gunners positioned in hull-down positions. The result was slaughter. British tanks were destroyed in dozens, then scores and hundreds. The advance ground to halt under weight of German fire. Tanks that attempted to push forward were knocked out. Tanks that attempted to withdraw were hit from behind. The battlefield became littered with burning Shermans and Cromwells. The Guards Armored Division, 7th Armored Division, and 11th Armored Division all suffered catastrophic losses. Individual tank regiments that began the operation with 50 or 60 tanks were reduced to 10 or 15 operational vehicles. Crews that survived knocked out tanks and attempted to retreat on foot were engaged by German infantry and artillery. By July 20th, Operation Goodwood was called off. British forces had advanced approximately 7 miles at maximum penetration, but hadn't achieved breakthrough. The cost was staggering. Over 400 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. Over 5,500 casualties. German losses were much lighter, perhaps 2,500 casualties and minimal tank losses. Operation Goodwood was the worst British armor defeat of the Normandy campaign and one of the worst British tank battles of the entire war. The operation demonstrated that German defensive tactics, defense in depth, long-range anti-tank fire, fighting withdrawal, could defeat even overwhelming armored attacks if terrain and preparation favored the defender. Throughout the battle for Caen, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend's conduct exemplified both the military effectiveness and moral bankruptcy of fanatical Nazi forces. The division fought with extraordinary determination and skill, but also committed war crimes that stained its reputation permanently. The Ardenne Abbey massacres on June 7th to 8th set the pattern. Canadian prisoners captured during fighting north of Caen were executed in groups. The killings were deliberate murders ordered by officers, including Meyer. Bodies were discovered by advancing Canadian forces, creating deep hatred between Canadian troops and Hitlerjugend soldiers. But the war crimes extended beyond Ardenne Abbey. Throughout June and July, reports accumulated of prisoners being shot, wounded soldiers being killed rather than taken to aid stations, civilians suspected of helping allies being executed. The Hitlerjugend operated under ideology that saw no value in mercy, that emphasized ruthlessness as virtue, that treated Geneva Conventions as weakness. The tactical effectiveness of the Hitlerjugend was undeniable. The division's counterattacks were aggressive and well executed. Defensive positions were held tenaciously. Officers led from the front. Witt was killed by naval gunfire while observing positions. Meyer was repeatedly in front lines directing troops. The teenage soldiers, indoctrinated from childhood, fought with determination that veteran units couldn't match. But this effectiveness came at horrific cost. The Hitlerjugend suffered approximately 60% casualties during the Normandy campaign. The division that entered battle with 20,000 men was reduced to effective strength of fewer than 5,000 by late August. Officers and NCOs, the Eastern Front veterans who provided leadership, were killed at extraordinary rates. The fanaticism that made the Hitlerjugend effective also made them inflexible and wasteful. Troops who wouldn't surrender or retreat were killed or captured in hopeless positions. Counterattacks that had no chance of success were launched anyway, resulting in casualties for no gain. The ideology that emphasized fighting to the death meant the division destroyed itself through attrition. Canadian forces, aware of the Ardenne Abbey massacres and other atrocities, showed little mercy to Hitlerjugend prisoners. Battlefield justice was common. Hitlerjugend soldiers attempting to surrender were sometimes shot. The cycle of atrocities and revenge escalated throughout the campaign. After the war, several Hitlerjugend officers were tried for war crimes. Meyer was convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted. Other officers received prison sentences. The division's war crimes are documented in military records, survivor testimony, and physical evidence. The Hitlerjugend's actions that can exemplify the Wehrmacht and SS descent into criminality during the war's final years. Before we continue with Operation Goodwood and the devastating British armor defeat, why the 12th SS Panzer Division's teenage fanatics committed war crimes while fighting to the death, and how Caen's destruction symbolized the terrible cost of liberation across France. If you're fascinated by these stories of strategic failures that question great commanders, of battles where overwhelming force couldn't break determined defense, of victories so costly they resembled defeats, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We publish deeply researched military history documentaries every week that bring you the operations that don't fit simple narratives, the battles where victory came at terrible price, the campaigns where civilians paid the cost of military decisions. Now back to July 1944, and the final operations to secure Caen completely. Montgomery's next attempt to break through German defenses around Caen was Operation Goodwood, launched July 18th. This was massive armored offensive involving 3 British armored divisions, approximately 750 tanks, attacking from Bridgehead east to contour the Borgebus Ridge. The plan called for concentrated armored thrust to break through German lines, exploit into open country, and force German withdrawal from Caen area. The operation would demonstrate British capability for mobile warfare and hopefully restore Montgomery's damaged reputation. The operation began with even larger aerial bombardment than Charnwood. Over 2,000 Allied bombers, heavy bombers, medium bombers, fighter bombers, dropped over 7,700 tons of bombs on German positions. The bombardment targeted known German defensive lines, artillery positions, and suspected tank concentrations. The bombing was followed by artillery bombardment from 720 guns. The combined bombardment was the largest tactical airstrike in support ground operations up to that point in the war. The intention was to stun German defenders, destroy defensive positions, and create conditions for armor breakthrough. At 0745 hours July 18th, British armor began advancing. The initial progress was encouraging. The bombardment had severely damaged German forward positions. British tanks penetrated several kilometers. By mid-morning, lead elements were approaching the Borgebus Ridge. Then the offensive ran into defensive system that the bombing hadn't destroyed. German forces had prepared multiple defensive lines with interlocking fields of fire. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns, deployed in anti-tank role, were positioned to engage at maximum range. German defensive doctrine emphasized defense in depth. Even if forward positions were overrun, subsequent lines would engage attackers. British tanks emerging from the bombardment area into open ground found themselves engaged by German anti-tank guns at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The flat terrain provided no cover. British tanks were silhouetted against skyline, visible to German gunners positioned in hull-down positions. The result was slaughter. British tanks were destroyed in dozens, then scores, then hundreds. The advance ground to halt under weight of German fire. Tanks that attempted to push forward were knocked out. Tanks that attempted to withdraw were hit from behind. The battlefield became littered with burning Shermans and Cromwells. The Guards Armored Division, 7th Armored Division, and 11th Armored Division all suffered catastrophic losses. Individual tank regiments that began the operation with 50 or 60 tanks were reduced to 10 or 15 operational vehicles. Crews that survived knocked out tanks and attempted to retreat on foot were engaged by German infantry and artillery. By July 20th, Operation Goodwood was called off. British forces had advanced approximately 7 miles at maximum penetration, but hadn't achieved breakthrough. The cost was staggering. Over 400 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. Over 5,500 casualties. German losses were much lighter, perhaps 2,500 casualties and minimal tank losses. Operation Goodwood was the worst British armor defeat of the Normandy campaign and one of the worst British tank battles of the entire war. The operation demonstrated that German defensive tactics, defense in depth, long-range anti-tank fire, fighting withdrawal, could defeat even overwhelming armored attacks if terrain and preparation favored the defender. Throughout the battle for Caen, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend's conduct exemplified both the military effectiveness and moral bankruptcy of fanatical Nazi forces. The division fought with extraordinary determination and skill, but also committed war crimes that stained its reputation permanently. The Ardenne Abbey massacres on June 7th to 8th set the pattern. Canadian prisoners captured during fighting north of Caen were executed in groups. The killings were deliberate murders ordered by officers, including Kurt Meyer. Bodies were discovered by advancing Canadian forces, creating deep hatred between Canadian troops and Hitlerjugend soldiers. But the war crimes extended beyond Ardenne Abbey. Throughout June and July, reports accumulated of prisoners being shot, wounded soldiers being killed rather than taken to aid stations, civilians suspected of helping allies being executed. The Hitlerjugend operated under ideology that saw no value in mercy, that emphasized ruthlessness as virtue, that treated Geneva Conventions as weakness. The tactical effectiveness of the Hitlerjugend was undeniable. The division's counterattacks were aggressive and well executed. Defensive positions were held tenaciously. Officers led from the front. Witt was killed by naval gunfire while observing positions. Meyer was repeatedly in front lines directing troops. The teenage soldiers, indoctrinated from childhood, fought with determination that veteran units couldn't match. But this effectiveness came at horrific cost. The Hitlerjugend suffered approximately 60% casualties during the Normandy campaign. The division that entered battle with 20,000 men was reduced to effective strength of fewer than 5,000 by late August. Officers and NCOs, the Eastern Front veterans who provided leadership, were killed at extraordinary rates. The fanaticism that made the Hitlerjugend effective also made them inflexible and wasteful. Troops who wouldn't surrender or retreat were killed or captured in hopeless positions. Counterattacks that had no chance of success were launched anyway, resulting in casualties for no gain. The ideology that emphasized fighting to the death meant the division destroyed itself through attrition. Canadian forces, aware of the Ardenne Abbey massacres and other atrocities, showed little mercy to Hitlerjugend prisoners. Battlefield justice was common. Hitlerjugend soldiers attempting to surrender were sometimes shot. The cycle of atrocities and revenge escalated throughout the campaign. After the war, several Hitlerjugend officers were tried for war crimes. Meyer was convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted. Other officers received prison sentences. The division's war crimes are documented in military records, survivor testimony, and physical evidence. The Hitlerjugend's actions that can exemplify the Wehrmacht and SS descent into criminality during the war's final years. The battle for Caen was catastrophic for French civilians trapped in the city. Approximately 15,000 civilians died during the 33 days of fighting, killed by bombing, artillery, street fighting, or collateral damage. Tens of thousands more were rendered homeless, their possessions destroyed, their livelihoods eliminated. The bombing of July 7th killed approximately 3,000 civilians in a single night. Many families were wiped out entirely. Bodies were buried in rubble for days or weeks before being recovered. Mass graves were dug to handle the number of dead. The psychological trauma affected survivors for the rest of their lives. Beyond immediate casualties, the destruction of eliminated infrastructure necessary for survival. Water systems were destroyed. Sewage systems collapsed. Electrical power was unavailable. Food supplies were disrupted. Medical facilities were damaged or destroyed. The civilian population that survived the fighting faced humanitarian crisis. Allied military authorities established refugee camps and provided basic necessities, but resources were limited. Military operations took priority over civilian relief. French civilians waited hours in line for food rations. Medical care was minimal. Military casualties received priority. Housing was improvised. Many families lived in ruins of damaged buildings or in makeshift shelters. The psychological impact was severe. Civilians who had endured for years of German occupation, hoping for liberation, found that liberation brought destruction as terrible as occupation had been. The joy of seeing Allied forces was tempered by grief for lost family members and destroyed homes. French attitudes toward Allies were complicated. Gratitude for ending German occupation coexisted with anger at the destruction. Questions were asked that had no satisfactory answers. Why wasn't the city evacuated before bombing? Why were residential areas targeted? Why did military operations destroy the city to save it? The relationship between French civilians and Allied forces improved gradually as immediate crisis passed and reconstruction began. But memories of July 1944 remained. It became symbol of liberation's cost, of the French civilians who paid the price for Allied strategy, of the communities destroyed in the process of being freed. The complete capture required additional operations after Charnwood and Goodwood had secured northern and eastern sections. German forces still held southern suburbs and used the Orne River as defensive line. Final operations to clear these areas lasted until early August. Operation Atlantic, launched July 18 concurrent with Goodwood, saw Canadian forces attack south toward Verrières Ridge. The fighting was brutal. Canadian casualties exceeded 1,500. The ridge changed hands multiple times before being secured. German counterattacks, including elements of newly arrived 9th SS Panzer Division, inflicted severe casualties on Canadian forces. Operation Spring, launched July 25th, attempted to exploit gains from Atlantic. The operation failed catastrophically. Canadian attacks ran into prepared German defenses. Artillery fire and counterattacks decimated attacking units. Canadian casualties exceeded 1,500 for negligible gains. The operation was called off after a single day. By early August, German forces were under pressure across entire Normandy front. American breakout in the west, Operation Cobra, forced Germans to shift forces from Caen sector. German High Command authorized withdrawal from Caen on August 9th. British forces occupied the remaining southern suburbs without significant resistance and was finally completely in Allied hands 64 days after D-Day. The city that was supposed to fall on June 6th required over 2 months of fighting. The cost was staggering. Approximately 50,000 Allied casualties in operations around Caen, including 18,000 Canadian casualties. German casualties were similarly severe. Estimates suggest 40,000 killed, wounded, and captured. French civilian casualties exceeded 15,000 dead. The strategic objective had been achieved, but the cost raised questions about whether alternative approaches might have been more effective. Could it have been bypassed? Could the attritional battle have been fought elsewhere? Could different tactics have reduced casualties? These questions will be debated for decades. The battle for Caen significantly damaged Montgomery's reputation as military commander. The failure to capture the city on D-Day as planned, followed by multiple failed offensives and mounting casualties, raised questions about his competence and strategic judgment. Montgomery's defenders argued he had executed exactly the strategy intended, drawing German armor reserves into attritional battle round while American forces broke out in the west. From this perspective, Caen was strategic success even if tactical progress was limited. The concentration of German armor around Caen facilitated American Operation Cobra. Critics argue Montgomery had promised more than he delivered. The claim that could fall on D-Day had been Montgomery's prediction, not imposed by higher command. The subsequent offensives, Perch, Epsom, Charnwood, Goodwood, were presented as breakthrough attempts but achieved only limited gains at high cost. The mounting casualties in destroyed French city represented strategic failure regardless of whether German reserves were pinned down. The debate extended beyond Normandy. Montgomery's conduct of operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had generated controversy. His cautious approach, methodical planning, and reluctance to take risks were seen by some as prudent professionalism and by others as excessive timidity, can reinforce both interpretations depending on perspective. Eisenhower's relationship with Montgomery deteriorated during the Normandy campaign. Eisenhower questioned whether Montgomery was being sufficiently aggressive. American commanders like Bradley and Patton were contemptuous of what they saw as British failure. The tensions created command problems that affected operations through the war's end. Churchill supported Montgomery publicly but privately expressed frustration. British casualties in Normandy were severe, and public patience with mounting losses was limited. Churchill needed victories to justify the costs. Caen wasn't a victory that could be easily sold to British public. Post-war, Montgomery defended his conduct at Caen. His memoirs argued everything went according to plan, that critics misunderstood his strategy, that Caen was a necessary part of overall Normandy success. But historians examining the documentary evidence found Montgomery's contemporaneous statements contradicted his post-war claims. He had promised breakthrough, not attrition. He had claimed operations would be decisive, not limited. The battle for Caen remains controversial in military history. Montgomery's defenders emphasized the strategic success of pinning German armor. Critics emphasized the tactical failures, excessive casualties, and destroyed city. The truth likely incorporates elements of both. Can achieve strategic purpose, but at higher cost than necessary through methods that could have been improved. The battle for Caen provided numerous lessons about urban warfare, the limits of aerial bombardment, and the challenges of breaking prepared defenses. The bombing campaigns, Charnwood's 2,500 tons and Goodwood's 7,700 tons, demonstrated that even overwhelming aerial bombardment couldn't eliminate determined defenders from fortified positions. The bombs destroyed buildings and infrastructure, but German forces in shelters and dispersed positions survived. The rubble created by bombing actually aided defense by channeling attackers into predictable avenues of approach. The experience reinforced lessons about urban warfare that had been demonstrated at Stalingrad and would be reinforced later at Aachen and Berlin. Cities are inherently defensible. Every building is potential fortress. Rubble provides cover. Civilians complicate military operations. Capture requires close combat that negates many advantages of modern firepower. The British and Canadian forces learned that armor operating without adequate infantry support in restrictive terrain was vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. Goodwood's tank losses demonstrated the need for combined arms operations where infantry, armor, artillery, and air support operate in coordination rather than independently. The casualty rates experienced by British and Canadian forces at Caen, particularly Canadian casualties, which were proportionally higher than British, demonstrated that even well-trained, well-equipped forces suffered severe losses attacking prepared defenses. The notion that firepower advantage and air superiority would enable cheap victories was disproven. The French civilian casualties highlighted the moral complexity of liberation. Military necessity sometimes required operations that caused civilian casualties. But the scale of destruction that can raise questions about whether all measures taken were truly necessary, whether alternatives existed, whether more care could have been taken to minimize civilian losses. The Hitlerjugend's fanatical resistance demonstrated that ideologically motivated forces would fight with determination that couldn't be easily broken by material superiority. The division's war crimes also demonstrated the Wehrmacht and SS moral collapse and the difficulty of fighting enemies who didn't respect laws of war. The reconstruction that began immediately after liberation, but required decades to complete. The scale of destruction was so extensive that rebuilding the city essentially meant constructing a new city on the ruins of the old. The immediate priority was basic infrastructure, restoring water and sewage systems, clearing rubble from streets, establishing temporary housing. Allied military engineers assisted with these tasks, but resources were limited as military operations continued eastward. The historic character of Caen was largely lost. Medieval buildings that had stood for centuries were gone. The Abbaye-aux-Hommes, Abbey of St. Etienne, founded by William the Conqueror in 1063, was damaged but survived. The castle of William the Conqueror survived with damage, but most of the medieval city center was obliterated. Reconstruction efforts in the 1950s and 1960s prioritized modern construction over historical restoration. The rebuilt Caen was functional modern city rather than recreation of medieval original. Some criticized this approach as completing the destruction that the bombing began. Others argued that modern city better served the needs of residents. The Memorial de Caen, opened in 1988, serves as museum and memorial commemorating the Battle of Normandy and emphasizing themes of peace and reconciliation. The museum includes extensive exhibits on D-Day, the battle for Caen, and civilian experiences during the battle. It serves as educational institution and site of remembrance. The French government officially recognizes the civilian casualties, acting as war victims. Memorial services commemorate those killed. The city's history teaches younger generations about the cost of war and the price French civilians paid for liberation. Canadian forces bore a disproportionate share of casualties in the battle for Caen. Canadian 3rd Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade were heavily engaged throughout June and July. Canadian casualties in Normandy exceeded 18,000, including over 5,000 killed. The Canadian role has been somewhat overshadowed in popular history by British and American operations. This is partially because Canadian forces operated under British command, and their contributions are sometimes attributed generically to British forces. It's also because American operations, particularly Operation Cobra and the subsequent Breakout, received more attention. But Canadian soldiers did most of the heavy fighting for Caen in July. Operations Atlantic and Spring were Canadian operations. The brutal fighting through villages north of Caen was largely conducted by Canadian infantry. The casualties suffered were proportionally higher than British forces experienced. Canadian forces also faced the Hitlerjugend's fanaticism and war crimes directly. The Ardenne Abbey massacres targeted Canadian prisoners. Canadian troops were aware they would receive no mercy if captured by the Hitlerjugend. This knowledge made the fighting more intense and contributed to the cycle of brutality. Post-war, Canadian veterans can face psychological trauma from their experiences. The intensity of combat, the casualties suffered, the destruction witnessed, the atrocities encountered, all contributed to what would now be recognized as PTSD. Canadian society in 1940s and 1950s lacked understanding or effective treatment for combat trauma. The Canadian contribution to Allied victory in Normandy deserves recognition. Canadian forces fought with courage and determination in some of the most difficult operations of the campaign. Their sacrifice helped achieve strategic objectives, even when tactical success was limited. The battle for Caen can be compared to other urban battles of World War II to understand its significance and unique characteristics. Stalingrad, fought September 1942 to February 1943, was larger in scale and longer in duration. The battle involved hundreds of thousands of troops and lasted 5 months. Casualties exceeded 1 million combined. But Stalingrad was fought in conditions of total war, where civilian casualties were accepted as inevitable. Caen was fought in context of liberation, where civilian welfare was supposed to be consideration. The Battle of Ortona in Italy, December 1943, saw Canadian forces fighting through Italian coastal town against German paratroopers. The fighting was intense street-to-street combat similar to Caen, but on smaller scale. Ortona lasted 8 days with approximately 2,500 Canadian casualties. Ortona provided lessons that should have been applied at Caen but weren't fully implemented. The Battle of Aachen, October 1944, was first German city captured by Allies. American forces fought for 3 weeks to capture the city. Unlike Caen, Aachen was evacuated of most civilians before the battle. Casualties were severe, approximately 5,000 American, but civilian losses were minimized through evacuation. The Battle of Manila, February-March 1945, saw American and Filipino forces fighting Japanese defenders in Philippines' capital. The battle destroyed the city and killed approximately 100,000 civilians. Manila's destruction exceeded even Caen's, demonstrating that urban warfare in Pacific Theater was even more destructive. The Battle of Berlin, April-May 1945, was the war's final urban battle. Soviet forces fought through fortified German capital against desperate defenders. Casualties exceeded 300,000 combined. Civilian casualties were enormous. Berlin's destruction was total. Compared to these battles, Caen was medium-scale urban battle with moderate casualties by World War II standards. But Caen's significance was its timing. Early in liberation of Western Europe, when expectations were that liberation would be rapid and relatively bloodless. Caen demonstrated that liberation would be long, costly, and destructive. In France, Caen symbolizes the cost of liberation. The city's destruction and civilian casualties represent the price French civilians paid for Allied strategy. French memory of Caen is complicated. Gratitude for liberation, mixed with sorrow for the cost. The bombing of July 7, 1944, remains controversial in French historical memory. Why wasn't the city evacuated? Why were residential areas targeted? Could the bombing have been avoided? These questions don't have satisfactory answers, which contributes to ongoing sensitivity. French historians examining the battle have been critical of Montgomery's strategy and the decision to use heavy bombers against the city. The consensus is that military necessity existed, but that insufficient consideration was given civilian welfare. The failure to warn civilians or attempt evacuation is seen as moral failing even if militarily justified. The relationship between France and Allied nations wasn't permanently damaged by Caen. French recognition of Allied sacrifice and appreciation for liberation outweighs anger at the destruction, but Caen remains a reminder that liberation came at terrible price, that French civilians were caught between German occupation and Allied liberation, that the war's end required destroying much of what was meant to preserve. French education about World War II includes substantial coverage of the Battle for Caen. Students learn about the civilian casualties, the destruction, and the complexity of liberation. The memorial and museum can serve as educational resources emphasizing that war brings suffering to all involved regardless of which side ultimately wins. The battle can influence military doctrine in several areas. The lessons were applied in subsequent operations in World War II and informed post-war military planning. The limits of strategic bombing and tactical role were demonstrated. Heavy bombers could destroy cities but couldn't eliminate defenders from fortified positions. This influenced how air power was employed in subsequent operations. Tactical air support using fighter bombers with precision weapons proved more effective than area bombing by heavy bombers. The importance of combined arms operations was reinforced. Armor operating without infantry support in restricted terrain was vulnerable. Infantry operating without armor support couldn't break fortified positions. Successful operations require coordination between all arms: infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, air support. The challenges of urban warfare were highlighted. Cities are inherently defensible. Attackers require numerical superiority, extensive fire support, and willingness to accept casualties. Defenders can delay attackers far longer than their numbers suggest they should be able to. Civilian populations complicate operations and create humanitarian obligations. The psychological importance of realistic planning was demonstrated. Montgomery's promise to capture Caen on D-Day, when achieved only after 2 months, damaged morale and created credibility problems. Commanders who overpromise and underdeliver lose the confidence of subordinates and superiors. Realistic assessments, even if less optimistic, serve military organizations better than optimistic predictions that prove inaccurate. The battle for Caen contributed to post-war British and Canadian doctrinal development. The lessons about armor employment, urban warfare, and the limits of firepower influenced how these armies trained and organized. The experience informed NATO planning during the Cold War. Germans never expected 2,500 bombers on single city because the scale of destruction was unprecedented in tactical context. Strategic bombing campaigns had destroyed German cities, but those were terror bombing campaigns against enemy populations. Caen was Allied city being bombed to facilitate its own liberation. The result was destruction that rivaled strategic bombing. 80% of the city destroyed, 15,000 civilians dead, medieval heritage erased. But the bombing didn't capture the city. German forces survived and continued fighting. The ground assault that followed the bombing required 2 more days of brutal combat and cost 3,000 Allied casualties. Caen was necessary victory in that capturing the city was essential to Allied strategy in Normandy. The city controlled communications, provided terrain for airfields, and anchored the eastern flank. German forces couldn't be allowed to hold Caen indefinitely. Some form of offensive operation was required, but the cost raises questions about whether the specific methods employed were necessary or optimal. Could Caen have been bypassed and isolated rather than captured through direct assault? Could the operations have been conducted with less bombing and fewer civilian casualties? Could different tactics have reduced military casualties while still achieving objectives? The answers depend on perspective and assumptions. Montgomery and his defenders argue that the methods used were necessary given the strength of German defenses and the strategic imperative to capture Caen quickly. Critics argue that alternatives existed, but weren't seriously considered, that excessive force was employed, that insufficient weight was given to civilian welfare and efficient use of Allied forces. What's clear is that the battle for Caen was one of the bloodiest operations of the Normandy campaign. Allied casualties exceeded 50,000. German casualties were similarly severe. French civilian casualties were catastrophic. The city was destroyed so thoroughly that rebuilding required decades. The strategic objective was achieved. Caen was captured, German armor reserves were pinned down, American breakout was facilitated. But the cost in lives and destruction was terrible. The battle for Caen demonstrates that even necessary military operations can be conducted in ways that impose horrific costs, that victory can be so expensive it resembles defeat, that liberation can destroy what it's meant to preserve. From June 6 to August 9th, From D-Day objectives unfulfilled to final capture after 64 days. From Montgomery's promises to French civilian tragedy. The battle can shape the Normandy campaign and question the cost of victory. 2,500 bombers dropped on single city. 80% destruction. 15,000 civilians dead. 50,000 Allied casualties. 40,000 German casualties. 64 days of brutal fighting. The city that was supposed to fall in hours. The battle that questioned Montgomery's competence. The bombing that destroyed the city to save it. The liberation that came at a price almost too terrible to accept. The battle for Caen, where Germans never expected the scale of destruction, where Allies learned that overwhelming force doesn't guarantee swift victory, where French civilians paid the price for strategic decisions, where medieval city was erased for military necessity.